Trump administration has an obligation as well, not just Mrs. DeVos if she were to be confirmed. They must commit, as an administration, to keep strong campus sexual assault protections in place and not go back to the dark days when this scourge was not a priority here in Washington, and not a priority on college and university campuses across the country. So if they want to fight on this, I am ready to fight for a long time against anyone who's going to try to weaken these protections. We are not going to allow this administration or any Secretary of Education to turn back the clock and allow young men to continue to prey upon young women without consequence, with impunity, as they often have been able to do over the years. Let me move to a second issue. Students with disabilities, often overlooked in our debates about education. We have debates about funding, debates about philosophy, debates about who has the best idea, and sometimes we forget students with disabilities who have a right under federal law to have the opportunity for a full education, an appropriate education. So ensuring that all students receive high-quality education is absolutely critical, and it's something that's particularly important for students with disabilities and their families. In my judgment, Mrs. DeVos displayed a total lack of knowledge regarding the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. That's a 1975 law, 4 decades old, so-called IDEA, and its predecessor was the so-entitled Education for All Handicapped Children Act, the old version of it, many years ago. They have been, together, the bedrock civil rights and education law that guarantees students with disabilities receive the same educational opportunities as their peers who do not have a disability. According to the Department of Education, prior to 1975, prior to IDEA, U.S. schools educated only 1 in 5 children with disabilities, and many states had laws excluding certain students, including those who were deaf, blind, emotionally disturbed, or intellectually impaired. Since the passage 40 years ago of IDEA, the vast majority of children with disabilities are now educated in public schools with their peers. We know that high school graduation rates are higher today than they've ever been. Students with disabilities are going on to higher education in greater numbers. In the last 2 decades, reading and math scores on the National Assessment of Education Progress have increased substantially. We've seen this from the beginnings of the debate in Pennsylvania. Way back in 1971, the Park versus Pennsylvania case, Park standing for the acronym PARC, one of the cases that helped establish the right of all children to have an appropriate public education. We know that in the hearing, Senator Kaine from Virginia asked Mrs. DeVos whether all schools that receive federal funding should have to meet the requirements of IDEA. She said, and I quote, "I think that is a matter that is best left to the states," unquote. Now, given that's obviously the wrong answer when you're talking about a federal statute, states don't have the option of not complying with federal law. Given the opportunity to clarify her answer, Mrs. DeVos continued to insist that states should be able to determine whether they provide services to students with disabilities. Well, let me just say it plainly. That is dead wrong. That's unambiguously, definitively wrong. States can't decide not to comply with the IDEA, the law that 40 years ago enshrined that basic right for students with disabilities to get an appropriate education. So I hope that by now, on the eve of her confirmation vote, I hope that she has done some studying and learned that IDEA is the law of the land. And if she wants to change it, she better line up votes in the House and the Senate to overturn the law that made sure that students with disabilities have those basic guarantees. Once again, the best words are from people that write to us and contact us about these issues. Kristen, who's from southeastern Pennsylvania, wrote the following with regard to her son. She said, being parents of a high-functioning autistic child, we value and cherish our public school system. In fact, our public school experience has been life-changing for our son. He's getting a great education and has made remarkable strides. He not only benefits from the resources, caring attention provided by teachers, administrators, assistants, and school staff, and an individualized education plan and accommodations afforded by IDEA, that federal law I just mentioned, that private schools can simply ignore and charter schools do a poor job of meeting. But, Kristen goes on to say, he has also had an opportunity to meet all sorts of kids. I'm proud and thrilled that his small group of friends include kids whose parents were born in other countries or who practice other religions. This is the benefit of a quality, well-funded public school education, an informed citizenry, and an introduction to the cultures and perspectives beyond our own neighborhoods, unquote. No one has said it better, in my judgment, than Kristen about the value of public education, the value of that public school to her son, who has autism, but he's a high-functioning autistic child, and the vistas of opportunities for learning that have been opened to that child because of that school and because of the IDEA that helps that child with a disability of any kind of disability to get an appropriate education under our system. And a lot of that started way back in the 1830s in Pennsylvania when the Free Schools Act was passed. So again, I say very directly to Mrs. DeVos as a nominee, and if she's confirmed, as the Secretary of Education. Mrs. DeVos must guarantee Kristen and her son that she will support public schools and children with disabilities without exceptions, not with equivocation, not with some bizarre, erroneous argument about what states might want to do, but full commitment, full compliance with the IDEA, full compliance with the law as it relates to any child with a disability. She has an obligation, once she takes the oath of office, a sworn duty as a servant of taxpayers, as a servant of those parents like Kristen, to make sure that she meets Kristen's expectations, not the expectations of a president, not the expectations of insiders here in Washington. She's got to answer to the expectations of Kristen and taxpayers like her and her son. So she has a heavy, heavy burden of proof based upon her testimony to date. Mr. President, I'm going to move to another topic, a topic that has been the subject of much attention lately, but frankly not enough attention over many years. And it's an issue that affects all kinds of children in our schools at various ages and in various circumstances. I'm talking about bullying, something that sometimes people in my generation somehow conclude has always been a problem, and it's just a continuing problem from one generation to the next. Well, they are wrong on the facts. It is a much worse problem today than it's ever been, and that's largely caused by the failure to deal with it, and also caused by the ability of the bullier to follow the bullied student home and to torment them, and sometimes to aggregate other bullies around them to torment them all day long in school and at home all through the night, day after day, week after week. So in addition to ensuring the equal protection of students with disabilities, as we just talked about, I'm also concerned that Mrs. DeVos will not be fully committed to enforcing civil rights protections for students, including those that identify as LGBTQ. This is obviously connected as well to the issue of bullying, because often the most likely victims of bullying, we know, are LGBT students and students with disabilities. It affects all students, there's no question about that. But too many stories, and too many newspaper stories in particular, about someone who was bullied persistently over time, and that has led to suicides and led to some terribly tragic outcomes for students and their families. Bullying, when you think about it, is, or I should say when we consider the tolerance we've built up, I guess, over years to allow bullying to continue, in many ways that's the ultimate betrayal of our kids. We say to our kids, go to school. You have to go to school and stay in class and pay attention and do your homework and study hard for quizzes and tests. And if you do that, you're going to progress, and you're going to be a person that has opportunities in the world. But you got to stay in school, and you got to concentrate on your work. It's the ultimate betrayal for us as parents, as a society, to tell that to a child, and then we put them in schools where the efforts against bullying aren't a priority. So it's a real betrayal of our children to send them to schools and then not protect so many of them from bullying. So in so many ways, as adults, we failed our kids when we allow that to happen. For many LGBTQ students, schools are anything but safe. The Centers for Disease Control in 2016 put out a report called the Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance Annual Report, which looks to the health and well-being of our 9th through 12th grade students. Students that identify as gay are almost twice as likely to have been threatened or injured by a knife or a weapon on school property. Twice as likely. Students that identify as gay are almost 3 times more likely to stay home from school because of safety concerns. 60% of students identifying as gay felt sad and hopeless almost every day for 2 or more weeks in a row that they had stopped doing usual activities. And finally, the most sobering of all, the rate of suicide attempts is 4 times greater. Let me say that again. Suicide attempts, 4 times greater for young people who happen to be gay, and 2 times greater for young people that are questioning than that of a straight young person. With the advent of text messaging, social media, and social networking, many children find they cannot escape the harassment, even as they go home at night. It follows them from the moment they wake until the moment they go to sleep. I'll give you one example from Pennsylvania. Right in the heartland of our state, Snyder County. You can't get much more small town and emblematic of the rural and small town communities in our state than a county like Snyder County. The story of Brandon Bittner, a teenager from that part of the state, central Pennsylvania, is a chilling reminder of the horror, the absolute horror of bullying. This is what one news account wrote. Brandon Bittner, 14 years old, of Mount Pleasant Mills, Pennsylvania, walked 13 miles from his home early Friday morning in November of 2010 to a busy intersection and threw himself in front of an oncoming tractor trailer after leaving a suicide note at his home. There seems to be little doubt in students' minds why Brandon did what he did. Quote from his friend, quote, "It was because of bullying." This friend wrote to the Daily Item, a paper in central Pennsylvania. Quote, "It was not about race or gender, but they bullied him for his sexual preferences, the way he dressed, which," she said, "they wrongly accused him of." unquote. We know that Brandon's suicide note reportedly explained that he was constantly bullied at Midwest High School in Middleburg, which is also Snyder County, where he was a freshman. Bullies allegedly called Brandon names. He stated in the note that a humiliating event in school this past week was, quote, the straw that broke the camel's back. Brandon was an accomplished violinist, having been a member of the Susquehanna Youth Orchestra in 2009. That is small-town Pennsylvania, Snyder County, right in the middle of our state. So you have a 14-year-old who's driven to suicide because of bullying, persistent, pernicious, violent, evil bullying that drove him to throw himself in front of a locomotive 13 miles from his home. Now, we know that laws can't wipe out human behavior or the darkness of human nature sometimes. And while we do have federal laws that promote school safety, there is currently nothing in place to comprehensively address issues of bullying and harassment. It's critical that anti-bullying and harassment laws and policies enumerate or list characteristics that are most frequently the subject of bullying and harassment, such as race, color, natural origin, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, disability, and religion. They're sometimes known in the law as protected classes. And it's important that in any bullying policies, those categories are so enumerated. This is the most effective strategy for preventing and prohibiting both bullying and harassment. Research shows the effectiveness of these policies, and even the American Bar Association agrees, passing a resolution unanimously in 2011 supporting enumerated protections, not vague references to protecting young people from bullying, very specific enumerated policies. Now, we've made progress in developing legislation, but we haven't gotten the support we need to get it passed. We tried this during the debate on the Every Child Succeeds Act, or Every Student Succeeds Act, which, as many of you know, is the reauthorization and many changes as part of the changes made to the No Child Left Behind legislation. But we didn't get this policy as part of that, so we have a ways to go. Now, I had hoped that the next Secretary of Education would be interested in tackling these issues, and while Mrs. DeVos has expressed a desire to work on preventing bullying, her record and financial giving seems to suggest otherwise, especially as it relates to LGBTQ students. Mrs. DeVos and her family's foundations, plural, have given millions of dollars to organizations which are expressly opposed to this work, much of the funding coming from the Edgar and Elsa Prince Foundation, which is one of her family foundations. So in other words, she's supporting groups that do not want to pass anti-bullying legislation that enumerates the protected groups of students. I think that's a big mistake. I think it's wrong. We'll continue to fight them, but I hope that, or I should say those donations that family foundations have made will not prohibit her from taking strong action against bullying as Secretary of Education. Once again, I'll say it. When she becomes Secretary of Education, if she's confirmed, she is no longer a private citizen engaged in fights about ideology or fights about policy or fights about politics. She is a servant of the people if she's going to be Secretary of Education. So I would hope she would rethink that original predisposition to be against these policies. I will move on because I know we're limited in our time. Mr. President, I wanted to conclude with a couple of remarks about questions regarding ethics and potential conflicts of interest, because that seems to be a persistent theme with regard to a number of the nominations. We know that these questions, a lot of questions have been asked lately of Mrs. DeVos. I wanted to review some of those. There are at least potential conflicts of interest if she became Secretary of Education. We know that we have a tradition, not only here in Washington in the federal government, but it was very much a part of state government in Pennsylvania when I served there, and part of the tradition in our state where we opt on the side of more transparency for candidates and for public officials about disclosure of information, especially information that could compromise an individual in public office. Tax returns, for example, when people run for office. Providing Mrs. DeVos's tax returns would be a small price to pay to become Secretary of Education as part of that transparency. It would also go a long way to ease the public's discomfort around some of the potential conflicts of interest in the assets and family trusts that Mrs. DeVos will be retaining if she were to be confirmed. The letter of agreement between Betsy DeVos and the Office of Government Ethics is necessary but not sufficient to alleviate her and her family's financial conflicts of interest. The Help Committee has always used its own requirements for vetting a nominee, which are and always have been a step beyond those gathered by the Office of Government Ethics. The committee requires full disclosure of all assets over $1,000 in the two-part committee questionnaire required by the committee rules. So there's a lot more to do, and I know we're running out of time. There's a lot more to do, I believe, in terms of her fully disclosing information about her family's or her own financial transactions, what stakes they will maintain in some of these entities if she were to be confirmed. And this isn't about probing someone who has a lot of personal assets and is wealthy. This is about taxpayers' right to know what their Secretary of Education or even a nominee for this job has in her portfolio and her family's. So I'll conclude with this. Our children and our families and our taxpayers deserve a Secretary of Education who is fully committed to being a champion for public schools and public education. And I'll hearken back to what Kristen said in part of the letter I read. Their public school experience has been, quote, life-changing. They value and cherish our public school system. I hope that Betsy DeVos, if she were to be confirmed, would value and cherish public education and make it a life-changing experience for every student in those public schools. For the many reasons I've outlined, I will vote against her nomination tomorrow. Mr. President, I would yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate the time. I think we've had a very interesting debate on Betsy DeVos and, frankly, on public education. Listening to my friends on the left, I've been encouraged because I'm excited that for the first time in a very long time, we're actually having a conversation about the important role of public education in America. This is a necessary component to success in life. I've been inspired by senators who have spoken eloquently and passionately about the importance of our public education system, the challenges that they fear might come with the appointment of Betsy DeVos to be Secretary of Education. I've also been disappointed and frustrated by some of the statements made by my friends on the other side. What this should not be, is a partisan issue. This is not an issue of Republicans versus Democrats. That is not what this is about. This is not even a political issue, nor is this an issue about teachers. I, for one, am so very thankful for incredible teachers. I think of Mrs. Lynch, Mrs. Greenberg, my fourth grade teacher, Mrs. Wynn, God bless her soul. I was a handful. I think of Coach Roberts and Mr. White. We called him Mighty White, Mr. White, what amazing English teacher I had in my senior year, or Miss Berry and Miss Myers, wonderful Spanish teachers. This is not about teachers. It's not.
All right, guys, this is so boring. We're going to go back to the news, man. This is terrible. It's so hard to sit and listen to. And this is going to go on and on all night long, they said, until Tuesday. And they're not going to stop talking to be able to confirm this woman. So we'll find out all the breaking news tomorrow. I just don't want to sit and listen to all this. So we're going to go back to the news. I'll be right back.